right, before we get started today, this is my first time coming to FDP, and I just want to get a sense of who we have in the room today. So if you wouldn't mind, just by a show of hands, how many of you folks in the room are research administrators at academic institutions or organizations? Oh, wow. Okay, so we've got a lot. Okay, how many of you are faculty members? Okay, fair amount. And NIH staff? Great. And other? Who didn't I get? Okay, other. All right. Okay, well, welcome. So today we're going to talk about NIH grantee support for the management of human subjects and clinical trials study information. So hopefully we'll have a bit both for you on the research administration side as well as you on the faculty side. This is a feedback session, so I encourage you to ask questions, offer comments. We don't, I believe, have a microphone for you all, so you can just raise your hand and speak. And we'll be getting, especially towards the end, we'll be doing a bit more feedback. Some key points for today's discussion. As part of its effort to enhance clinical trial stewardship, NIH is developing an electronic system to manage human subjects and clinical trial information. And as we'll talk about, this is one of many things that we are doing to enhance stewardship of our clinical trials portfolio. And we expect this system will streamline current processes, reduce duplicate entry, and improve data to enhance NIH's oversight of clinical trials. So before we talk more about the system and what it's going to do, I just want to provide context for why is NIH developing a system to manage human subjects and clinical trials information. So many of you may be familiar, over the last couple of years, NIH has had a number of initiatives aimed at enhancing clinical trial stewardship. Among those initiatives are creating clinical trial-specific FOAs so that proposals and applications for clinical trials come into specific clinical trial FOAs. Those FOAs include review criteria that are specific to clinical trials and help us ensure that we're only funding the highest quality research. We also have some updated application forms. I don't know if any of you have been working on the new human subjects clinical trials form. Has anyone had any experience with that in the room? Okay, okay, good. So some of you have seen that. So that form is part of these efforts. We've expanded registration and reporting requirements in clinicaltrials.gov. We're requiring use of a single IRB for multi-site studies. We have implemented a requirement for good clinical practice training for investigators and their staff working on clinical trials research. And as we discussed, we have review criteria. So there are a number of efforts here, and all of them are aimed at improving our stewardship of clinical trials. By improving our stewardship, I mean that we improve the accountability and transparency of our clinical trials and the information coming out of those trials, and also the efficiency of those trials. We want to make sure that the knowledge and treatment that come out of those trials get to people as quickly as possible. So I have here's a quote from Dr. Thomas Insole, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Now I admit I'm biased in picking this. I did work at the National Institute of Mental Health for 14 years, including with Dr. Insole. And Dr. Insole concluded in 2014 that recent performance of our clinical trials program is not acceptable. Recruitment is too slow, registration in public databases is not consistent, and reporting takes too long to meet the needs of the public. I can say that I worked with Dr. Insole during his time in looking into clinical trials and the problems with efficiency, transparency, and accountability. And one of the things that we found is that it was very difficult for us even to get good data, to know how we were doing in the clinical trials portfolio, to look at things like, are trials registering and reporting results? Are they completing on time? And so we saw that we really needed a better system to be able to get enough information so that we can more carefully monitor our clinical trials and make sure they're doing what we need them to do. Now, in fact, Dr. Insole isn't the only person who thought this, but the GAO in 2016 produced a report stating that additional data would enhance the stewardship of clinical trials across the agency. And the report concluded, while we had some data on clinical trials, NIH needed to finalize what kind of data that it needed in order to enhance the stewardship of clinical trials. And that it acknowledged that NIH was limited in its ability to make data-driven decisions regarding its use of roughly $3 billion in annual investment in clinical trials. So we have a lot of money going out in clinical trials. Certainly, we all want clinical trials to be successful, but we have very little data that tells us how our clinical trials are doing. So in 2016, later that year, Dr. Francis Collins, along with Dr. Mike Lauer and Kathy Hudson, released this article in JAMA, Toward a New Era of Trust and Transparency in Clinical Trials. And this article outlined a number of steps that NIH would take to improve the clinical trial enterprise. Many of those are the things that we talked about earlier, things like GCP training, single IRB, using the clinical trial-specific funding opportunity announcements. But among these efforts that they called for is the development of a standardized electronic system that NIH could use for management and oversight of NIH-funded clinical trials. And that this system would be used for strategic planning, as well as identifying the best, safest, and least burdensome ways to gather important data to improve human health. I want to add, in addition to the many efforts around clinical trials reforms, we also had some additional reporting requirements that came out of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed last December in 2016. And among these requirements is that NIH shall assemble accurate data to be used to assess research priorities, including data on study populations of clinical research, so participant data, which specifies the inclusion of women, members of minority groups, relevant age categories, and including pediatric subgroups. So for those of you who've been involved, either as a faculty member or as a research administrator in human subjects research, you may know that NIH has been collecting data on the inclusion of women and minorities for quite some time, over 20 years in fact. However, we've never collected data on age of participants, and certainly we don't have any data currently on pediatric subgroups of our research participants. So this is a new requirement that we both had to be able to collect data on age, and we needed to compile data. We need to report on it. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on and how the electronic system will address that. So I've given you a bit of the lay of the land. Hopefully now you understand why we're doing what we're doing and why we have this new system to manage human subjects and clinical trials information. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing this. And I want to start the conversation around the new Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form, really because this form, which it seems like many of you are familiar with, is kind of at the crux of this system. The form, which is something that you provide in your application if you're doing human subjects research, and you will be updating at the time of your progress report, includes much of the information that we're collecting in this electronic system. So the form for the first time consolidates all human subjects, inclusion, clinical trial information, all into one form, rather than having this information in various places across the application. And information is now collected at the study level rather than the application level. Having been at NIH for a number of years, I can say it's often very difficult for us to monitor things at the study level, especially for grants or cooperative agreements or contracts that involve more than one study. We've not had a good way of tracking things at the study level over the years. So this form takes care of that, and now we have all the information about the study all in one form. The form also captures structured data on human subjects and clinical trials. So we have a protocol synopsis, which includes many of the data elements in clinicaltrials.gov, for example, that we're now collecting in a structured way. And it aligns with clinicaltrials.gov, and we'll be talking a little bit more about how the form does that. So this form is just one piece of the system, and as you can see in this diagram, the vision of this system is that the form works with other pieces of the process of oversight and management of human subjects and clinical trials to get all data into one place. And this one place is here in the middle, the ERA Human Subjects and Clinical Trials module. So information from the form feeds into the module. I should mention that extramural grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, and intramural studies all complete this form and submit data into this module. We also collect data from the application, from peer review. The module includes the ability for program oversight and progress reporting, strategic analysis and reporting, and it also works with clinicaltrials.gov. And as you can see, the idea is that we will be exchanging information back and forth with clinicaltrials.gov. We have another piece here which isn't electronic currently, but that's the NIH FDA protocol template. This is available on our website, and this template includes a number of the data elements that you will see on the form, and make sure that our studies that are doing research on drug or devices include the information, have the information they need for an IND or IDE. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about what specifically you're going to be doing in this system that includes all of these elements. So for recipients, post-submission, typically your interaction with the system would be through the RPPR. If you've seen the Human Subjects Clinical Trials Information Form, you know that you fill that out in your application, and you will update that form along with a milestone section in your submission of your RPPR.
I'm sorry, so is that form that's in grants.gov or system to system, how does that information get into this RPPR? Is there a data transfer from Commons into the system, or are we having to retype the data into another system?
No, you won't have to retype the data, and I will qualify that I'm not a systems person, so I have to, so I can only speak from probably maybe elementary level on this. But the form will be submitted with the application. Those data will live in the system. When you go,
Which system?
This new system, the new ERA, Human Subjects and Clinical Trials system. The system's going to look a lot like IMS, if you've used IMS before, which is the inclusion management system that you've used to submit enrollment data. And in fact, that's going to be a piece of this system. So if you've used that before, one thing that you'll know is when you go to complete an RPPR, it's going to show you what you submitted last time. And you go in and you update it in the RPPR. So it's a similar concept in that your form will live in our systems. You will not be required to re-enter everything from year to year, but the idea is that you just update what's new from year to year on each study. Okay. If you have anything you want to add, Sam, please feel free. So for most of you, your interaction with the system will be when you provide your updates into the RPPR, and they will feed into the system. You can also access the system via the ERA Common Status module, and generally, you wouldn't need to go in separately from the RPPR, but you may need to. For example, if you want to make corrections after an RPPR submission, if you have off-cycle updates, maybe you have a delayed onset study that's now begun and you want to fill out the information for that, you can go in through the ERA Common Status module and complete that information. Also, if your IC has asked that you submit interim progress reports, you can provide that information if your IC requests through this system, that you can go in, for example, and report recruitment data more often than just once a year, but every 6 months, for example. Within the system, you can add and update study information. You can update enrollment data. You can provide updates, for example, on adverse events, how you've been meeting your study milestones, and as well as clinicaltrials.gov registration and reporting. So again, most of these things would be by completing that form in the RPPR would be your interaction with the system. So I gave you kind of a very rudimentary overview of what the system will look like, and now I want to talk about a few features of this system that we hope are going to make your lives a little bit easier. So the first thing I want to talk about is the synchronization with clinicaltrials.gov. This is something I think quite exciting. So most of you who have been reporting to clinicaltrials.gov may know that you're required to update the data in clinicaltrials.gov at least every 12 months. So if you've had a protocol amendment, if you've started recruitment, for example, you want to make sure that information is current in clinicaltrials.gov. It's always been a completely separate process that you also provide us a progress report generally every 12 months to NIH, and you tell us how your study is doing. Now we actually have the opportunity that we can do both of those things at the same time. So the system will pull data directly from clinicaltrials.gov into the human subjects and clinical trials system. So for example, if you've updated clinicaltrials.gov to indicate that your study is recruiting, that data will come to us and will be pulled into your progress report without you having to go in and make a separate update on the form. Something to keep in mind is that updates to your study that are clinicaltrials.gov data elements should be made in clinicaltrials.gov. We will be overriding data that you provide us outside of clinicaltrials.gov with the clinicaltrials.gov data. So for example, if you've been working on the form, you know that you can complete a study record and send that to us. Often when you are submitting an application, you will have not completed the clinicaltrials.gov registration process at that point. So that information may or may not match what's in clinicaltrials.gov. But when you submit your RPPR, that information will be pulled directly from clinicaltrials.gov. So that's where you should be making the updates once you've started your clinicaltrials.gov registration. I should also mention, right now, we're also working on the ability to push data in clinicaltrials.gov so that you can use that information that you provide us on the form directly to complete your clinicaltrials.gov study registration. That's not going to be available for our first release, which is going to be here in late May, early June. But our intention is that you can provide information in your application, and then you can use that information as the beginning of your clinicaltrials.gov registration record, so that you don't have to duplicate data entry. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay. Another feature of the system is associated studies. So this is something new that we've not done before, is that NIH staff may associate studies from other projects, another grant, contract, or cooperative agreements. So why would you want to do this? Do any of you do, for example, collaborative grants or cooperative agreements, like collaborative R01, collaborative use? Any institutions or investigators have experience with these? Okay. So if you've ever tried to submit progress reports for these, you know that the process of submitting information can be cumbersome. You have to get information, for example, from the Data Coordinating Center or another site, and to be able to provide complete information to us. There's always a question of who's reporting the enrollment data, are we reporting it more than once, now we have duplicate entry, and who's reporting the other study information. Well, this feature actually makes it a little easier for those of you, especially with the collaborative grants or cooperative agreements, and that we can associate a study with your project. And that will give you read-only access to that study information. So for example, if I have a collaborative R01, I'm doing the exact same study, but I'm going to be doing this across 4 different R01 grants. We can choose one of those grants that will be the primary reporter. They will be providing all of the information that's needed to update the form. They will be providing the enrollment information. The other sites will simply have read-only access to that information. They will not have to provide new information every time. So this makes it a little bit easier so that as long as you have one site that can do the reporting and you can work that out with your PO and determining which site that can be, we don't have any special rules about that, then every site doesn't need to enter the same information about the study. The idea really, the goal is that eventually we will get to having one study record per clinicaltrials.gov ID or NCT, so that if you've submitted your information to clinicaltrials.gov, you only need to have one person updating that information, reporting that to NIH. The rest of you are still going to, it's still going to be included in your RPPR, but it's going to be via that read-only access. And so if you wanted changes to that, you would contact the person who's doing the primary reporting to make those changes. So we're excited, sorry, yes?
Don't we already have that clarity with the responsible party for clinicaltrials.gov?
Exactly. So it's a very similar concept to clinicaltrials.gov, where one person is the responsible party, and then that person reports everything for that study. And if you need any changes, that's who you need to go through. It's a similar concept. We've never had that before with our ERA systems. I should mention that the primary reporter does not have to be the responsible party. It can be whomever you choose. It could be a data coordinating center. Maybe easier for that person to be the responsible party because they can make the updates. But that's up to you. But yes, it's a similar concept in that we don't have this information about the same trial coming from 4 different places when we're asking for the same data elements. That doesn't mean that you don't address the study in your progress report. Of course, you'll want to talk about it in your piece. You just don't have to provide those standard data elements like a protocol synopsis, enrollment data, and whatnot. Right now, only NIH staff can make this association, so if you're interested in using this feature, you'd want to contact your program official, and they can assign a site as a primary reporter or other sites as associated studies. And just to reiterate, which I talked about a bit, is that all updates need to be made by the primary reporting project. Now, we can change the primary reporter over time. Sometimes things may happen where one site, for example, is discontinued and the other sites are ongoing. We can switch the primary reporting to another site at any point, but we just need to make sure that you all are aware who's doing the reporting and that person understands their responsibility for updating that information. So you can see here, just a little example of how this would work. When you would log into the system, you can see your associated studies reported on other projects, and you can see a list. This is test data, so there's 12 screens. I don't anticipate most of you would have that many associated studies, but we don't have, we have pretty high limits on the number of studies that can be associated. Any questions? Okay, so another feature of the system, as I mentioned, we had a requirement under 21st Century Cures to report data on the age of participants for the first time. And as we tried to approach this, we thought about the feedback that we've received from you all over the years about our inclusion forms. As I mentioned, you've been submitting data on the race, the ethnicity, and the sex or gender of participants for about 20 years. And over the years, we've heard feedback about the forms, either that they're kind of hard to use, they're confusing, they take a lot of time to fill out. And our conundrum was, well, now what do? We're required by law to ask for even more data in addition to the data that we've been asking for. But we're very reluctant to have you all fill out yet another form, kind of slicing and dicing the distribution of your participants in yet another way. So the solution that we came up with was to give you the ability to upload individual level data on the sex or gender, the race, ethnicity, and the age of participants. And that you can do this using a CSV file. So you could use Excel, whatever data software that you're using to provide this information. I should mention these are de-identified data. We are not collecting at this point any participant identifiers at all. We do not want that information in our database. However, we are treating the information as PII, meaning that it's potentially identifiable. So access to these data, once you submit it, will be restricted on NIH's end, and that one would have to have a data use agreement. That doesn't mean that we won't be able to see these data once you submit them. What will happen is that you can submit the data using an Excel file, for example. And here's an example of what that may look like. So you'll see here where you have columns for race, ethnicity, sex or gender, age, and a unit of age. Based on feedback we received both from the pediatric and the geriatric research communities, we are allowing units from hours to years. For some of our pediatric research, they've requested to use very small units for age, and so you do have that flexibility to use the units that make the most sense for your study. As you can see, you'll have these columns for each of these, and then you'll have rows which indicate this information for each participant. So we can see, for example, in this study, one of the participants identified their race as Asian, their ethnicity as not Hispanic or Latino, that person was male, and that person was 23 years old. And you can see on the next row, we had a participant who was white, Hispanic or Latino, female, and 6 months old. So you can see that this is a lot of information that we're collecting about individuals. And it's very exciting for us in that for the first time we can really look at the intersection of all of these variables, and it will help NIH be able to understand who's participating in our studies, who's not participating in our studies. Are there certain subgroups? For example, are older African Americans participating in our studies at the same rate as older white Americans? So there's a lot of potential for these data, and we're very excited about it, but we're also going to be very careful about it. So while you do submit the data to us in this format, when we look at the data, we're going to see a form that looks something like this. Okay, so your program officer is going to see the data displayed in the same form that we've been using for quite some time, and they will see a breakdown, an aggregate for sex or gender, race, ethnicity, and we will be adding age to this form as well. So we've been receiving feedback from the community about what do you think about this, about the ability to upload individual level data on these variables. And I think the feedback has been, for the most part, positive. We really hope that this is something to reduce burden. For many investigators, if you're collecting the data in this format anyway, it may take you 5 minutes to be able to provide this information to us, rather than spending time going through those tables and trying to figure out what belongs there. There's also a bit of apprehension, will my data sets work with this? And so I really encourage those of you who are interested to start using this feature. We expect this feature is going to be available with the late May, early June release of the new human subjects clinical trials system. However, it's not required for applications, and it's not required until applications that are submitted for January 25th, 2019 due dates or later. So if you're submitting in a little over a year, you will be required to provide individual level participant data with your progress reports. For those of you who are submitting now, you are not required to do so, but you do have the option to do so. And I would encourage you to go ahead and try it, and please share your feedback with us. Again, we want this to be easier for you all, and if there are challenges, barriers, we would like to know about them up front so that we can make this as easy as possible. So our next steps for the system is expected to deploy early summer 2018, as I mentioned, late May, early June, we're expecting to deploy. As I mentioned, our initial release will not include the ability to push data from clinicaltrials.gov, but we are planning a later release that will incorporate that functionality. We will have the ability to pull data from clinicaltrials.gov, though, in that initial release. And as I mentioned, the piece on individual level data will be required for applications submitted January 25th, 2019 or later. So with that, I am happy to take any questions. Yes?
So, you talked about the ERA Commons, and I'm just trying to, visualize this. You described it as a module. Is it a tab and a feature within ERA Commons, or is that a single login?
That's right. So if you've used the inclusion management system for uploading enrollment data, it would be much like that. And the idea is that it would be accessible through the ERA Commons status module. If you go in there now, you can find inclusion, the ability to submit inclusion data under the actions section in there. And I don't think I have a slide on it, but we don't currently have screenshots on that because the module hasn't been developed yet. But that would be where you would be accessing it. And again, for most of what you're providing, you're going to be providing the information in the application, and that data will be transferred into our system from the application. And then you would be providing the information in the RPPR, and the information in the RPPR would be transferred. I should mention that with the individual level data, we are looking into allowing an XML file, so that if we have system-to-system transfers of data, that we can facilitate that in a way that's a little more easier. We know that some of you may have systems already where you're capturing participant data in this way, and if you do, we want that process to be as easy as possible. Yes?
You mentioned eventually the clinical trial data will override, so it sort of wins because it's the system of record if you want to put a term on it or something.
Right.
Given that we're going to be providing this at the study level, not at the project level,
Right.
how will you know which one to override the data coming in from clinical trial? Are we going to have to keep that linkage in our systems?
So once you register in clinicaltrials.gov, we will collect the NCT number. And we ask for each study record that you have no more than one NCT number that's associated with that. So once we get the NCT number, when we pull that data into the RPPR, we will be checking clinicaltrials.gov and pulling the most recent information associated with that NCT. We will be providing you a warning message so that you'll know before your data are wiped out, that says, hey, the data on your form does not match what's currently in clinicaltrials.gov, and we're going to overwrite it so that you have an opportunity to save any information or make adjustments in clinicaltrials.gov if needed. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
We have some feedback that CT.gov is not that user-friendly. So, I wonder, what we can do about that, if that's going to be the main issue.
I know the Office of Science Policy has been working with clinicaltrials.gov over the past year or so, and the purpose of those efforts has really been to make this process easier for you all. We've certainly received feedback from a number of folks that this isn't as easy as we'd like it to be. The process of submitting registration information and the process of results reporting takes longer than we would like it to. So there are a lot of efforts right now that are working on that. I should say, though, that because we are using the clinicaltrials.gov information, there's not a plan for us to delay that, regardless of how clinicaltrials.gov works. And we hope that, while we hope those enhancements will be available when you're submitting your information, when you're submitting your progress report, we will be looking at that NCT number. So it's going to be very important for those of you who are submitting this information to make sure that you know who the responsible party is, that if information needs updated in clinicaltrials.gov, that those folks are contacted in enough time before you submit so that you can make those changes there in clinicaltrials.gov. Because what we've seen over the years is that clinicaltrials.gov tends not to be updated as often as we would like it to be. Folks do send us the information in the progress reports, and they tell us how their trial may be doing. They may put off updating clinicaltrials.gov. Maybe they run into an error or quality control glitch, and things kind of get stuck in the interim. So we want to make sure that folks are updating their records regularly. Again, the requirement is every 12 months those should be updated. It makes sense for you as an institution to put that on a schedule that works with an RPPR submission. So if I know the deadline for my RPPR submission is in May, I may want to think about when do I want to make sure the clinicaltrials.gov information is updated so that I'm not scrambling in May to go in and change things in clinicaltrials.gov.
So who's responsible for working on safety.gov improvements?
Well, NLM owns clinicaltrials.gov. I know that they've been working with OSP in terms of a point of contact for system improvements.
I think Becky Williams,
Becky Williams. Okay.
Vanessa Larger, and everything.
Yes.
Does it work for projects that were deemed not clinical trials that are awarded maybe in their first year, but then are going to go through a renewal or a progress report? Are they grandfathered in, or are they needing to abide by the new RPPR?
That's a good question. So if you submitted an application, say today, it's before the January 25th deadline, and you determined your application was not a clinical trial, even though maybe it was, or even if you did say it is a clinical trial, you would not be required to complete all of the same information that those applications that are submitted for the deadlines January 25th, 2018 or later are going to have to provide.
I was thinking more a grant that's just been awarded within the past year or so, and as they transition to the progress report at the beginning of the fiscal year,
Mm-hmm.
do they have to start, I mean, are they going to have to switch midstream through the grant to start using these reporting standards, even if they didn't start with that?
Right, so let me just show you a bit of the form and kind of what that looks like, because I think what your question is getting at is, do I have to fill out now all this information about everything when I go submit my RPPR? So the answer is no. If you didn't fall under these requirements, the form will be available to you. However, all of these fields are not necessarily going to be required. So you'll only be required to report that information that you would expect to be required to report. If you identified your grant as a clinical trial, there's certain information that you now provide. The NCT number is something you provide, for example. I think whether or not it's an applicable clinical trial may be on there. So you'll be providing a minimum of information. One thing, though, which is kind of nice about the clinicaltrials.gov feature, as you can see in Section 4, Section 4 is the protocol synopsis. And I know that this print is very small, but it more or less aligns with clinicaltrials.gov's protocol synopsis. There are a few differences here. So if you do provide your NCT number on the form, even if you weren't grandfathered in, it will populate all this information here for you, regardless of whether or not you actually meet the requirements. And so what's helpful about that is it provides a lot of information that you may want to provide in your progress report that will come up right for you. Is your study recruiting, for example, and other information that may be relevant. But again, you will not be required to provide all of the information if your grant was not submitted under the current policy. Thank you. My pleasure.